I was general counsel of a university that was in financial trouble in the 80s and 90s, and we brought in the best experts to make it the most prosperous university in the country now. One of the most prosperous, I should say.
Prosperity, a blessing or a snare? If our prosperity preachers had checked the writings of John's companion, they would have found an urgent warning against seeking material prosperity, not a message of physical health and material wealth. In fact, the early Christians testify that the apostles themselves lived in poverty, not material wealth. Rather than viewing wealth as a promised blessing from God, the early Christians viewed it as an entanglement that could cost a Christian his eternal life. They based this understanding on scripture passages such as,
"The love of money is the root of all kinds of evil. Keep your lives free from the love of money, and be content with what you have, having food and clothing. With these we shall be content." A bishop then must be blameless, not greedy for money. Command those who are rich in this present age not to be haughty, nor to trust in uncertain riches.
Come now, you rich, weep and howl for your miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches are corrupted, and their corrosion will be a witness against you and will eat your flesh like fire. You have heaped up treasure in the last days.
Joining me now is Liberty University President Jerry Falwell Jr., who's a Trump supporter. Jerry, thanks so much for being with us. When you hear Donald Trump refer to Elizabeth Warren as Pocahontas, when he calls Secretary Clinton a lowlife, do you take issue with that at all? Is that a Christian thing to do, in your opinion?
Well, I'm president of a university. We have a Division I football team, and we have lots of players who might have relatives or friends on opposing teams, but when the whistle blows, it's every man for himself. And I think politics is the same way. And I think it's the way the game is played. It's a blood sport. And I wouldn't expect anything less from somebody who wants to win the presidency.
I know you said that people should stop trying to choose political leaders who they believe are the most godly because only God knows people's hearts. What about judging candidates according to their actions? I mean, isn't that really the only way to assess who a candidate is, what they actually believe in?
No, I think the way to assess a candidate is their experience. I think with Donald Trump, his experience and success in the private sector is one of the reasons I chose to support him, because I've been president. Before that, I was general counsel of a university that was in financial trouble in the 80s and 90s, and we brought in the best experts to make it the most prosperous university in the country now. One of the most prosperous, I should say. And it's, I think the country needs the same type of, I think the country needs a doctor who has the cure for America's ills. I think we're at a turning point. I think we could lose our country if we don't choose the right president this time. And I think Donald Trump is the man for this point in history.
You still lack one thing. Sell all that you have and distribute to the poor, and you will have treasure in heaven. And come, follow me. Indeed, it is easier for a camel to go through a needle's eye than for a rich man to enter the kingdom of God. Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth, but lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. For where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. No one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or else he will be loyal to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and mammon.
Applying some of the verses cited above, Hermas wrote,
"These are those who have faith indeed, but also have the riches of this world. When tribulation comes, they deny the Lord on account of their riches and business. As a result, those who are rich in this world cannot be useful to the Lord unless their riches are first cut down. Learn this first from your own case. When you were rich, you were useless, but now you are useful and fit for life. Refrain from much business and you will avoid sin. Those who are occupied with much business also commit many sins, being distracted by their business affairs instead of serving the Lord."
Clement warned that,
"Wealth can single-handedly puff up and corrupt the souls of those who possess it and turn them from the path of salvation."
He described wealth as
a weight that ought to be removed and taken away as though it were a dangerous and a deadly disease.
Cyprian, a wealthy man who gave all his goods to the poor upon becoming a Christian, admonished the members of his congregation with these words:
A blind love of one's own property has deceived many. How could they be prepared for or comfortable with departing this earth in persecution when their wealth fettered them like a chain? Therefore the Lord, the teacher of good things, forewarning of the future, says, If you will be perfect, go, sell all you have and give to the poor, and you shall have treasure in heaven. And come and follow me. If rich men did this, they would not perish by their riches. Heart, mind, and feeling would be in heaven, if the treasure were in heaven. He who had nothing in the world would not be overcome by the world. He would follow the Lord unfettered and free as the apostles did. But how can they follow Christ when they are held back by the chain of their wealth? They think that they own, when actually it is they who are owned. They are not the lords of their money, but rather the slaves of money.
Drawing from Jesus' illustration of the broad and the narrow roads, Lactantius warned against those who promised wealth and prosperity.
Satan, having invented false religions, turns men away from the heavenly path and leads them into the way of ruin. That path seems to be level and spacious and delightful, with all kinds of flowers and fruits. For Satan places on this path all the things which are esteemed on earth as good things: wealth, honor, leisure, pleasure, and all sorts of enticements. But hidden along these are also injustice, cruelty, pride, lust, fights, ignorance, falsehood, folly, and other vices. But the end of this way is as follows. When they have reached the point of no return, it is suddenly removed, along with its beauty. And it is so sudden that no one is able to foresee this fraud before he falls head first into a deep abyss. In contrast, the heavenly path seems to be difficult and hilly, covered with painful thorns and strewn with jagged rocks. As a result, everyone must walk with the greatest care and must take precautions against falling. On this road, God has placed justice, self-restraint, patience, faith, chastity, self-control, peace, knowledge, truth, wisdom, and other virtues. But along with these go poverty, lowliness, work, pain, and all kinds of hardships. For whoever has extended his hope beyond the present life and chosen better things will be without these earthly goods, because he is lightly equipped and free of hindrances. He can overcome the difficulty of the way. For it is impossible for the man who has surrounded himself with royal pomp or loaded himself with riches, either to enter this path or to persevere in the face of these difficulties.
But the early Christians didn't just talk about poverty. The majority of them were poor, and the Romans ridiculed them for it. For example, one Roman taunted the Christians,
See, many of you, in fact by your own admission, the majority of you are in want, are cold, are hungry, and are laboring in hard work, yet your God allows it.
Admitting the truthfulness of this accusation, the Christian lawyer Mark Felix answered,
That many of us are called poor, this is not our disgrace, but our glory. As our mind is relaxed by luxury, it is strengthened by poverty. Yet who can be poor if he does not long for anything, if he does not crave possessions of others, if he is rich towards God? He rather is poor, who, although he has much, desires more.
The anti-materialistic message of the early Christians was so strange to the Romans that they ridiculed Christianity. The Roman critic Celsus asked the Christians,
How could God command the Jews through Moses to gather wealth, to extend their dominion, to fill the earth, and to put the enemies of every age to the sword, while on the other hand his son, the man of Nazareth, gave laws quite opposite to these? He declared that no one can come to the Father if he loves power, riches, or glory, that men should no more worry about obtaining food than the ravens, that they should be less concerned about their clothing than the lilies.
Some might argue that these Christians lived in poverty only because they rejected God's prosperity and gave their wealth away. But how can a person outgive God? If wealth is from God, a Christian can't lose it by obeying God's word and sharing his wealth with the poor. In the first few centuries, it was the heretics, not the church, who taught prosperity theology. For example, one of the most infamous heretics of the 3rd century, Paul of Samosata, both taught and practiced a message of wealth. A group of elders living in his day described him this way.
Formerly he was destitute and poor. He inherited no wealth from his father. He did not acquire anything by trade or business. But now he possesses abundant wealth through his wrongdoing and sacrilegious acts. He has made his followers rich. Because of this, he is loved and admired by those who desire such things.
I wonder what you worked obviously closely with your dad, who founded the Moral Majority. What do you think he would have made of Donald Trump?
I think he was roundly criticized for supporting Ronald Reagan over Jimmy Carter, who was a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher. Ronald Reagan was a Hollywood actor who had been divorced, remarried. Everybody said my dad was an apostate for supporting somebody like Reagan. But Reagan turned out to be a much better president for issues that Christians were concerned about than Jimmy Carter was. And And I think you have to look past. You can't be, we're not electing a pastor-in-chief. We're electing a commander-in-chief, and we can't expect our commander-in-chief to have the same qualities as our pastors.
Separation from the world.
No one can serve two masters,
Declared Jesus to his disciples, Matthew 6:24. However, Christians have spent the greater portion of the past 2 millenniums apparently trying to prove Jesus wrong. We have told ourselves that we can indeed have both the things of God and the things of this world. Many of us live our lives no differently than do conservative non-Christians, except for the fact that we attend church regularly each week. We watch the same entertainment, we share the same concerns about the problems of this world, and we are frequently just as involved in the world's commercial and materialistic pursuits. Often, our being not of this world exists in theory more than in practice.
I had one pastor tell me that if we don't secure our borders, if we don't rebuild our military to fight terrorism, if we don't do something about the terrible debt problem, then the social issues are going to be a moot point. We've got to save our country first. And I think at the end of the day, the few that are still on the fence about Trump because they don't like his behavior will do what's best for the United States and will elect Donald Trump.
The letter to Diognetus, the work of an unknown author, written in about 130, describes Christians to the Romans as follows.
They dwell in their own countries, simply as sojourners. They are in the flesh, but they do not live after the flesh. They pass their days on earth, but they are citizens of heaven. They obey the prescribed laws, and at the same time they surpass the laws by their lives. They love all men, but are persecuted by all. They are unknown and condemned. They are put to death, but restored to life. They are poor, yet they make many rich. They possess few things, yet they abound in all. They are dishonored, but in their very dishonor are glorified. And those who hate them are unable to give any reason for their hatred.
Brothers, let us willingly leave our sojourn in this present world, so we can do the will of him who called us. And let us not fear to depart out of this world, deeming the things of this world as not belonging to us, and not fixing our desires upon them. The Lord declares, no servant can serve 2 masters. If we desire then to serve both God and money, it will be unprofitable for us. For what will it profit if a man gains the whole world and loses his own soul? This world and the next are 2 enemies. We cannot therefore be the friends of both.
Cyprian, the respected overseer of the church in Carthage, stressed a similar theme in a letter he wrote to a Christian friend.
The one peaceful and trustworthy tranquility, the one security that is solid, firm, and never changing is this: for a man to withdraw from the distractions of this world, anchor himself to the firm ground of salvation, and lift his eyes from earth to heaven. He who is actually greater than the world can crave nothing, can desire nothing from this world. How stable, how unshakable is that safeguard? How heavenly is the protection in its never-ending blessings? To be free from the snares of this entangling world, to be purged from the dregs of the earth, and fitted for the light of eternal immortality.
Are evangelicals putting aside, kind of thinking, well, okay, he may have, things in his past, he may have indiscretions, he may not be the standard bearer for the evangelical movement, but that's not what we need right now? Is that essentially what it boils down to?
That's exactly where most of them are now. I talk to them every day, and it's just, we've got to save the country first. It's just like if you had a sick child who needed a doctor, you would want the doctor most qualified to treat that child, not necessarily a doctor that shares your faith.
We can't have both Christ and the world. Lest we think that the early Christians were describing a lifestyle that they didn't really practice, we have the testimony of the Romans themselves. One pagan antagonist of the Christians remarked,
They despise the temples as houses of the dead. They reject the gods, they laugh at sacred things. Wretched, they pity our priests. Half-naked themselves, they despise honors and purple robes. What incredible audacity and foolishness! They are not afraid of present torments, but they fear those that are uncertain and future. While they do not fear to die for the present, they fear to die after death. At least learn from your present situation, you wretched people, what actually awaits you after death. See, many of you, in fact by your own admission, the majority of you are in want, are cold, are hungry, and are laboring in hard work, yet your God allows it. He is either unwilling or unable to assist his people. So he is either weak or unjust. Take notice. For you there are threats, punishments, tortures, and crosses. Where is the God who is supposed to help you when you come back from the dead? He cannot even help you in this life. Do not the Romans, without any help from your God, govern, rule over, and have the enjoyment of the whole world, including dominion over you yourselves? In the meantime, living in suspense and anxiety, you abstain from respectable pleasures. You do not attend sporting events. You have no interest in public amusements. You reject the public banquets and abhor the sacred games. Thus, wretched as you are, you will neither rise from the dead nor enjoy life in the meanwhile. So if you have any wisdom or sense, stop prying into the heavens and the destinies and secrets of the world. Persons who are unable to understand civil matters are certainly unable to discuss divine ones.
When we read the criticisms that the Romans leveled against the Christians, we must painfully realize that no one would accuse Christians today of those same charges. We aren't criticized for being totally absorbed in the interests of a heavenly kingdom, ignoring the things the world has to offer. In fact, Christians today are accused of just the opposite. We are accused of being money-hungry and hypocritical in our devotion to God.
We need a president who's willing to fight our enemies, to take the battle to them, to not be afraid, to not back down.
Is war morally wrong? Church history books mention that the early Christians generally refused to serve in the military. Many of those books said the early Christians weren't opposed to bloodshed, rather they rejected military service in order to avoid participating in idolatrous practices. But that's not true. In their writings, the early Christians clearly stated they opposed war because they literally followed Jesus' commandments to love your enemies and turn the other cheek. They viewed war as morally wrong. Justin Martyr wrote in his Apology to the Romans,
We who formerly murdered one another now refrain from making war upon our enemies.
Tertullian raised the following question about war.
Can it be lawful to make an occupation of the sword, when the Lord proclaims that he who uses the sword shall perish by the sword? And shall the Son of Peace take part in battle, when it does not become him even to sue at law? Shall he apply the chain, the prison, the torture, and the punishment, when he is not the avenger of his own wrongs?
When pagans began circulating a rumor that Christianity was a sect that had broken away from Judaism by armed revolt, Origen answered this false charge with these words.
Nowhere does he teach that it is right for his own disciples to offer violence to anyone, however wicked. For he deemed the killing of any individual to be against his laws, which were divine in origin. If Christians had owed their origins to a rebellion, they would not have adopted laws of so exceedingly mild a character. These laws do not even allow them on any occasion to resist their persecutors, even when they are called to be slaughtered as sheep.
Arnobius, an apologist living in the 3rd century, explained the Christian position to the Romans in this manner.
We have learned from his teaching and his laws that evil should not be repaid with evil, that it is better to suffer wrong than to inflict it, and that our own blood should be shed rather than to stain our hands and our conscience with that of another. As a result, an ungrateful world has now for a long period been enjoying a benefit from Christ, for by his means the rage of savage ferocity has been softened, and the world has begun to withhold hostile hands from the blood of a fellow creature.
At a time when military valor was considered to be the greatest of virtues, the early Christians stood alone in declaring that war was simply murder on a grand scale. How ironic, therefore, that evangelical Christians in the United States not only condone war, but are generally more militaristic than other segments of society. We are often labeled as warmongers by the world. In fact, I know of no war in the entire history of the United States that evangelical Christians opposed in any significant numbers. But doesn't a Christian have a responsibility to help defend his country, you may ask? The early Christians would have answered, yes, but in a very different way than the world. The Romans made the same charge to the early Christians, and the Christians replied,
We are urged to help the king with all our might, to work with him in the preservation of justice, to fight for him, and, if he requires it, to fight under him, or to lead an army along with him. Our answer is that we do, when occasion requires, give help to kings, but in a divine way, putting on the whole armor of God. We do this in obedience to the injunction of the apostle. I urge, therefore, first of all, that supplications, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for all men, for kings, and for all those in authority. The more anyone excels in holiness, the more effective is his help to kings, even more than is given by soldiers who go out to fight and slay as many of the enemy as they can. To those enemies of our faith who would require us to bear arms for the empire and to slay men, we reply, do not the priests who attend your gods keep their hands free from blood, so that they may offer the appointed sacrifices to your gods with hands unstained and free from human blood? Even when war is upon you, you never enlist the priests in the army. If, then, that is a praiseworthy custom, how much more, so that while others are engaged in battle, Christians too should engage as the priests and ministers of God, keeping their hands pure. By our prayers we vanquish all demons who stir up war. In this way, we are much more helpful to the kings than those who go into the field to fight for them, and none fight better for the king than we do. Indeed, we refuse to fight under him, even if he demands it. But we do fight on his behalf, forming a special army, an army of righteousness, by offering our prayers to God.
We may be inclined to call their view unrealistic. The early Christians called it trust. Who is right? History would indicate that perhaps these Christians weren't as naive as they might seem to us. During the period from the birth of Christ to around the beginning of the 3rd century, the Roman Empire didn't experience even one successful invasion of its frontiers. Historians call this the Pax Romana, or the Roman peace, and view it as a rather extraordinary period in the history of Roman civilization. For 200 years, the ancient Mediterranean world enjoyed peace, something it did not have before the Pax Romana, and something it has never had since. Of course, no secular historian would credit this peace to the presence and prayers of the Christians, but the early Christians firmly believed that it was a result of divine intervention. For example, Origen asked the Romans,
How, then, was it possible for the gospel doctrine of peace, which does not permit men to take vengeance even upon their enemies, to prevail throughout the world, unless at the coming of Jesus a milder spirit had been introduced everywhere into the conduct of things?
In contrast, after the time of Constantine, when Christian teachers such as Augustine began teaching the doctrine of holy war and Christians supported Rome with the sword, the entire Western Roman Empire collapsed within a few decades. Did the Roman Empire fall because the Church changed its position on war? No human can answer that question with certainty, but at the very least it's certainly a remarkable coincidence that Rome prospered and was safe from its enemies, so long as the Christians served as a special army of righteousness, trusting only in God for the empire's protection, and that once Christians began to wage physical war on behalf of Rome, the empire collapsed.
It just blows my mind when I see the President of the United States say that the answer to circumstances like that is more gun control. I mean, if the people... If some of those people in that community center had what I've got in my back pocket right now, is it illegal to pull it out? I don't know. Is that... Anyway, I've always thought if more good people had concealed carry permits, then we could end those Muslims before they walk in and kill it. I just wanted to take this opportunity to encourage all of you to get your permit. We offer a free course, and let's teach them a lesson if they ever show up here. So.
Nowhere does he teach that it is right for his own disciples to offer violence to anyone, however wicked. These laws do not even allow them on any occasion to resist their persecutors, even when they are called to be slaughtered as sheep.
We have learned from his teaching and his laws that evil should not be repaid with evil, that it is better to suffer wrong than to inflict it, and that our own blood should be shed rather than to stain our hands and our conscience with that of another.
We could end those Muslims before they walk in and kill it. So let's teach them a lesson if they ever show up here. So.